Even if you don't like the Las Vegas event, you have to like what this track provides and the races we've got now in 2023 and 2024. This race was beautiful chaos. It pretty much had everything a GP should have, with drama moments, good racing. We got crowned a world champion, very well deservingly so, and just action to keep you occupied for the full 1 hour and 30 minutes of runtime we got with this Las Vegas GP. There's plenty of talking points here, whether it's Mercedes being dominant in the race or Ferrari really blundering this race, and Charles Leclerc having what wasn't a great GP, but there's many components with that, and him actually being very livid with the Ferrari team because of what both Carlos decided to do and how Ferrari handled the situation. So with that being said, let's talk over the race, because there's many points as to what led up to Charles having his real meltdown on the radio by the end of this GP. Now, coming into this race, qualifying was already exciting, with Gasly going up to P3, and we thought that Ferrari would actually be the front runners. Carlos definitely put in a very good lap, but the Mercedes car was on fire. From practice 1 to practice 3, then qualifying, George made it stick, and Lewis probably would have been on pole, if not P2, if it wasn't for the mistakes that he ended up actually making in qualifying. So the pit lane opens up and most drivers are starting off on the mediums, which was the suggested strategy anyways, but this GP definitely threw in a surprise with it being a 2-stop for most drivers. And obviously this GP is going to have your celebrities with Jared Leto, Terry Crews, and so forth. It is a big spectacle and pretty much is going to be that way as long as it's on the calendar. With the lap starting out, George actually ends up retaining P1, but Leclerc makes a great move going down the inside on both Gasly and Carlos, and while it wasn't a dive bomb, it was very well calculated and it got him in a great position to fight for victory. The positions pretty much stayed the same. Verstappen ends up staying in 5th, Lando is in 6th. There is somewhat of a battle, but you can tell that McLaren car, even from the start, isn't as fast as the Red Bull. But Leclerc is automatically on George Russell's tail and trying to catch him and go for the overtakes. In both lap 3 and in 4, George makes great defensive moves where Leclerc is forced to try and go around the outside. He attempts to, but there really isn't too much of a way that you can make this overtake from the outside unless you fully commit, and there could be a crash, which Leclerc was trying to avoid. This then ends up continuing into lap 5 as well. Very aggressive turns. Leclerc is trying to stick it on the outside, very well defended by George, and pretty much a perfect race by him. It has to be talked about. He's had an amazing season alongside a 7-time world champion, which is extremely impressive. And now in 2025, he's going to have pretty much his own team with Kimi being there next to him. It'll be nice to see what George can do leading this Mercedes team. And Lewis, in the meantime, is making up positions, finally catching up to Piastri. He's going quick. This car was lightning because of the conditions. It really helped out the car. This isn't going to be their true pace, so don't expect Mercedes now in Qatar to be jumping off the walls, but it is a very quick car when the conditions hit what they need. In the meantime, around lap 8 or 9, this is where the Ferrari boys kind of start the scuffle, because Sainz ended up actually retaining his tires much better than Leclerc did, but both drivers end up falling back and the pit stops start to happen. Verstappen actually ends up overtaking both Carlos and Charles in that first stint. Oscar ends up pitting, and so do both the Ferraris on lap 11, which then ends up actually giving us a order of George in first, Perez is in second, but that's because he stayed out. Most other drivers pitted. Max in third, Sainz in fourth, Leclerc is down to 6th. He will be catching Sainz very quickly, but that's the order as of currently. Gasly, who had an outstanding qualifying, sadly goes out after the first pit stop, gets a DNF. He's still pretty clean and has no damage, so that's still very impressive by Gasly, but very unfortunate for the race. And as we get to lap 22, Hamilton starts to catch up to these Ferrari boys, and I guess we expected it because of how quick this Mercedes car is, but that is where the Ferrari boys start to kind of fall off. Their tires are not holding on as much as we thought they would. And while he ends up going and overtaking Leclerc, he now gets to Carlos, who's been asking Ferrari to make a pit stop. He wanted a pit stop earlier because the graining is happening to the tires, and this is obviously going to be a 2-stop race. So in that meantime, he tries making the call to Ferrari. They do not end up coming out, that pit crew in general. And while he's going into the pit lane, he has to end up bailing out, which shockingly enough, he didn't get a penalty for this. Usually a penalty is given if you go over the line for the pit lane. But he bails out, goes straight, has to continue his lap. Charles then continues on more laps, and now Carlos has to make a pit stop the next lap, which is quite the conundrum between Ferrari making a mistake on both Carlos, which probably did not make him very happy. So then if Charles pits, because now a lot of time was lost on Carlos having to cut that pit lane and so on, more than likely Charles would be ahead. So it pretty much favors him the strategy, and what happened, it was a mistake from Ferrari big time. But as Charles makes his pit stop, and here is where it happens. Ferrari tells Carlos, do not go for the overtake. We do not need this to happen right now between the drivers. And regardless of what the Ferrari team says, on the cold tires, Leclerc really can't defend going into turn 4, and Carlos makes the overtake, which could be argued in different ways. You could be on Leclerc's side and say, okay, I mean, he should have listened to the team and let us fire up and then let's go catch them together. Or you can listen from Carlos' side, who ended up getting screwed over on the last couple of laps, regardless was ahead of Charles and probably the faster driver this weekend. It's definitely up in the air on who was correct in this position. It's a very big toss-up in my opinion. I'd love to hear your thoughts on in the comments below. What do you guys think, and do you truly believe that really one driver is more right than the other? I think it's just kind of a bad scenario because of Ferrari. And the racing continues. There's overtakes like crazy. Perez makes a beautiful dive bomb, and I gotta say, it was a great move on Liam Lawson and Kevin Magnussen. He's been rivals with Liam, who's obviously in the slower car, but a nice overtake and a pretty good GP for Perez, I might add. And we do have somewhat of a fight, which I knew was going to end up being what it was. Hamilton realistically was never catching George. It was just George letting down on the pace and letting the race settle. He had it in the bag. It was a beautiful performance by that of George, which also crowns us with the 4-time world champion Max Verstappen, because he is ahead of Lando. Made a whole dedicated video to that, talking about his whole season. Go ahead and check that out. It's an Unchained movie, production by me. And with that, that leads us into the very end of the race, where Leclerc has quite the frustrated radio. And I'll let you listen for yourself, and then you tell me if it's correct or not. It's going to be a little sped up, but you'll get the gist of it.
Yeah, I did my job, but being nice knocks me over all the fucking time. It's not even being nice, it's just being respectful. I know I need to shut up, but at one point it's always the same, so.
Now, as he says, it's a matter of respect because of the timing of what happened, and really he should have listened to the Ferrari team, is what Leclerc is saying. And this has happened multiple times in the season where Carlos has not listened to Ferrari while Leclerc has been the more lenient driver between the two of them, which is why he's saying he's too nice. And I can understand his frustration. Honestly, in this scenario, I do think that Carlos also had the right to go for the overtake, because why should he listen to Ferrari? They dropped him for another driver. At this point, he has no other connection to Ferrari. It's not his job now to make sure that Leclerc is ahead of him, if you understand what I'm saying. As a driver, he will be selfish in those instances, and that's why Carlos is going for it. And I do think Leclerc is valid, but so is Carlos. It's more on Ferrari to really get this settled between the two drivers. If there is a decision made, one has to stay behind the other, but it was for a podium position, and Carlos was the quicker driver this weekend. I'd really love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Quite the radio by Charles. He is also a driver that wears his heart on his sleeve, so that's just kind of how he is, and that's another thing that I love about him. I like that he's expressive like this. Ferrari definitely didn't want that over the radio. And it'll be interesting to see the dynamic between these two at the very last couple of GPs, because they need to work together to try and overtake McLaren, who's going to be extremely strong in Qatar. I'd love to hear your thoughts down in the comments below. Please leave a like, subscribe. It would mean the world, and peace.